It's a hard life, this freedom they talk about, harder than some can imagine, even after the fighting's done. Folks talk about liberty, about grand ideas, but I see the cost. I see it in the empty space beside me in this bed, in the hunger in my children's eyes. They say this country is free, but what about us? What about those like Phillis? I heard about her, of course. Phillis Wheatley, a name whispered in hushed tones, almost a legend. A young girl, ripped from her home, from everything she knew, when she was no older than my own Martha here. 7 years old, they say, taken from a place rich with stories and song, and thrown into the belly of a ship. Can you imagine the terror, the silence, then the chaos? She wouldn't have known America, wouldn't have known a word of English. Only her mother's voice, the feel of her own earth, the rhythm of her people's tales. Then came the chains, the tearing away from everyone she loved, and that terrible journey, the Middle Passage, where even strong men didn't always survive. She arrived in Boston on a ship called the Phillis. That's where her name came from, they say. Her true name, the one her mother gave her, lost forever, bought by the Wheatleys, a tailor and his wife. Folks up north, they didn't have the big plantations like the South, but it was still chains, still bondage. They say Phillis was sickly, frail. But Susanna Wheatley, she saw something in that child. A spark, maybe the way Phillis looked at books, how quickly she learned new words, and then a rare thing happened. They taught her to read. Mind you, she was still enslaved. Her body wasn't her own. Her freedom wasn't hers to claim. But something extraordinary did happen. She learned English in 18 months. Then Latin, Greek, the Bible, all those old stories. By 12, she was reading Ovid and Homer and Milton. No schoolhouse, no classroom. Just her mind, a quiet refuge. I can almost see her, hunched in a corner by candlelight, her small fingers tracing words on a worn page, memorizing lines from Pope while the house bustled around her. Outside, talk of revolution, of liberty, was stirring in Boston. But inside, this child, still property in the eyes of the law, was building a world of her own, a universe of ideas. It wasn't a fairy tale, mind you. She must have been so alone, a black child, an intellect in a white world that didn't truly accept her. No playing in the streets with other children, no gentle lessons. She absorbed it all in a place that never quite saw her as family or as an equal. But she wrote and she dreamed. Her early poems, they weren't just copies of what she read. They were quiet acts of defiance, proof that her mind, her soul, couldn't be chained. Her words became her resistance, long before she was free. Her journey started in darkness in that ship's hold, with a language not her own. Yet from that place, Phillis Wheatley emerged, not just to learn, but to show the very people who enslaved her that her mind could not be shackled. It began not with glory, but with survival, not with freedom, but with an unyielding will to be more than the world allowed. Imagine being 12, knowing the world didn't see you as fully human, and still writing poetry that amazed scholars. While most women couldn't vote, couldn't speak in public, and enslaved people were denied the right to their own names, she was writing in Latin and reciting scripture from memory. No classroom, no chalkboard, no friends to whisper with. Just a quiet corner, candlelight, and the Iliad in her hand, sounding out Homer in a tongue she'd never heard before this land. That kind of brilliance, it was almost unbelievable for the time, and many didn't believe it. The Wheatleys, they educated her, yes, but it wasn't out of radical kindness. They were still enslavers. They didn't see her as an equal. Perhaps they thought her talents would make them look enlightened. So they gave her books, taught her languages, but it was a life under constant watch, still within the tight grip of enslavement. Phillis took it all in. She didn't just read, she thought. Her poems wove together faith, old philosophies, and the aching truth of her own bondage. Her faith, it became powerful, a lens. She looked at the world through scripture and saw both its cruelty and the hope of redemption. Take that poem on being brought from Africa to America. At first, it sounds like a thank you. But listen closer, and it's a challenge to her enslavers. She reminds them that Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. Subtle, elegant, but a thunderclap. A reminder that black souls are divine too. It was her way of saying, I belong to God, not to you. She wasn't calling for revolt, not writing manifestos. She wrote from her experience, from her belief. Her God wasn't far off. He was there in the books, in her pain, in the words she shaped. I heard tell of an old minister in Boston, Reverend Thomas. He got a letter one morning, a poem folded inside. He read it aloud, shaking his head. Couldn't believe a young black girl, enslaved, could write with such grace, such wisdom. He went to the Wheatley house himself, not to praise her, but to make sure it wasn't a trick. And there she was, small, quiet, with serious eyes, reciting line after line, silencing the room with her calm truth. That was her life, always proving her mind, always proving she was human. She started publishing in local papers, and her name grew, but doubts remained. So in '72, to quiet the talk, 18 important Boston men ministers, politicians, poets signed a paper saying she truly wrote her own work. Unheard of for a young black woman still enslaved. But even with all that attention, she was caught in a tangle, celebrated but not free, admired but still distrusted. Her poems were praised in fine homes, but her very humanity was still questioned. And still, she wrote about liberty, about death, about salvation, about loss. She saw what others refused to see, that you could be in chains and still have a mind that soared beyond anyone's reach. Her genius wasn't just in her words, it was in her strength, her refusal to be silent, her insistence on being seen, not as a symbol, but as a soul. In a time when her very existence went against the rules, she didn't just survive, she spoke. And that voice, once nurtured by candlelight, now echoes through time. Because no matter how tightly society tries to bind a person, there's no chain strong enough to silence a mind that knows its own worth. Imagine being so gifted that your work found a publisher not here, not in your own country, but across the ocean in London. That's what happened to Phillis. Before America truly saw her genius, London did. By the early 1770s, she had dozens of poems about faith, nature, freedom. Some were in New England papers, but a whole book that was different. In colonial America, publishing a book was hard enough, but for a black woman enslaved, nearly impossible. No American publisher would risk it. Some didn't believe she wrote them. Others thought a book by a young African girl wouldn't sell. That mix of prejudice and doubt, it kept doors shut. So the Wheatleys looked to England. Nathaniel, a family friend, sailed to London with her poems, hoping to find someone who would say yes. Phillis, only about 19, waited, wondering if anyone across the sea would see her for who she was, a poet, not just an educated slave. And someone did. Selina Hastings, the Countess of Huntingdon, a supporter of the church and of black writers. To her, Phillis was more than a curiosity. She was proof of God's grace for everyone. With the Countess's help, a London publisher agreed. In 1773, her book, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, was released in London, the first book ever published by an African-American woman, a girl stolen from Africa, raised in chains, barely out of her teens, publishing a book in the heart of the British Empire. And London embraced her, a bookseller on Fleet Street, laying out copies of her small book. A gentleman picks it up, curious, reads a line that stops him cold, about redemption or liberty or God's creation. He reads it again and realizes this isn't just an experiment. This is talent. Even the English elite were impressed. Phillis was invited to London to meet them. But then, the bitter part, she was on her way, passage booked, when word came that Susanna Wheatley, her mistress, was very ill. Phillis returned to Boston before she could make the journey. She never walked those London streets, never heard her book praised in a British parlor, but her name was there already. Her words carried across the ocean into hands that never imagined a poet like her. That recognition, it did more than start her writing career. It shamed the American elite. Imagine it, a girl enslaved here, whose mind flourished despite everything, and whose brilliance had to be confirmed by a foreign empire, before her own country paid attention. That should have been a wake-up call. Phillis Wheatley didn't just write poems. She challenged what people thought was possible. She made them rethink who could have genius, who could create art, who had a soul. And even now, her journey reminds us that sometimes the light has to come from far away before people see what's been shining right in front of them all along. Imagine being asked to prove your own mind. Not your work, not your words, but your very ability to think, to feel, to create. That was Phillis Wheatley's challenge in 1772. Just 19, standing before the most respected white men in Boston, forced to prove her poetry was truly hers. It wasn't enough that her verses were full of classical and biblical ideas. It didn't matter she'd already published in newspapers. People still doubted. How could an enslaved black girl with no schooling write with such skill? The idea shattered their comfortable beliefs. So instead of celebrating her, they demanded proof. Not a review, not encouragement. Proof of her intellect. Proof of her humanity. Picture that room, warm with summer air, or perhaps dim with candlelight. 18 white men around a table, ministers, judges, poets, politicians. Men like Reverend Samuel Cooper, John Hancock. Not radicals, not yet. Guardians of the old ways. Men who could read Latin, quote Milton, and still own other people. And there stood Phillis, small, calm, maybe a little nervous, but perhaps not. She'd known doubt all her life. I remember Sarah, a white servant girl in the Wheatley house, who once wondered how Phillis could understand Pope's poetry. She just copies it, Sarah might have whispered. She just recites what she hears. That was the assumption, not that she created, but that she mimicked. But in that room, Phillis answered every question. She recited from memory. She talked about her sources, Milton, Homer, the Psalms, with such clarity and ease. She didn't argue or beg. She simply performed. Her words carried the weight of her truth. And one by one, the men were silenced, not by loud defiance, but by quiet brilliance. I remember hearing the rumors later that week, down at the print shop. Did you hear? That enslaved girl, she passed the test. I shrugged it off, still unsure. But I remembered her name. So did Boston. Because after that day, the panel signed a formal statement declaring Phillis Wheatley was indeed the author of her poems. Their stamp of approval, not just on her book, but on her mind. That statement became the introduction to her book, published in London. Her poetry needed a certificate, like a passport, to be believed. It wasn't just a literary judgment, it was a moral one. A young girl had to stand before those who claimed to be the gatekeepers of reason and argue, simply by being herself, that she was fully human. That moment tells you everything about that time. The same men who would soon cry for liberty from Britain couldn't yet imagine liberty for someone like Phillis, but she could. She didn't need their permission to dream, only space to speak, and when she did, the world changed. Quietly, perhaps, but for good. Because in proving her authorship, Phillis Wheatley didn't just defend her poems. She defended the right of every unheard voice to one day rise and be believed. Imagine writing a heartfelt tribute to General George Washington, celebrating liberty, while you yourself are still in chains. That was the contradiction Phillis Wheatley lived, an enslaved black woman in Boston, writing verses that echoed the very ideals of freedom being shouted in the streets. It's hard to grasp, isn't it, that someone denied their own liberty could still believe so deeply in the cause of it. In 1775, Phillis wrote to His Excellency, General Washington, full of admiration, hope, and images of Columbia leading American troops to victory. And she sent it to him, George Washington, commander of the Continental Army, a man who even then owned enslaved people himself. Picture him at his desk, boots muddy from camp, reading a poem from a young enslaved girl he'd never met. He paused, read it again. Maybe he was surprised, maybe moved, but we know this. He wrote back. He thanked her, called her words a striking proof of your poetical talents, and he invited her to visit him at headquarters in Cambridge. A gesture that, even if brief, acknowledged her dignity. But here's where the story gets even more tangled. while white revolutionaries cried liberty or death. Phillis Wheatley lived the hypocrisy of the American Revolution. How could a nation fight for freedom while holding thousands in bondage? It's a question I, Thomas, a blacksmith who fought for his freedom in that war, asked every day. Or Sarah, a free black mother in Rhode Island, watching her husband march off to fight a war that might win freedom for some, but not for them. And yet, Phillis didn't turn away from the revolution. She leaned in. In her poems, she spoke of America's promise, sometimes gently, sometimes boldly. She called out tyranny but didn't name her own. Some say she was cautious, even strategic. Others say she was hopeful, believing liberty would reach her too. It's easy now to ask, why didn't she denounce slavery more directly? But imagine her position, still legally owned, still dependent on white allies to publish her work. Speaking too boldly could have meant silence, permanent silence. So she used metaphor, subtlety. She used the very language of her oppressors to carve out space for herself. Years later, after she was freed, Phillis's life grew harder. She married, lost children, struggled to find people to support her writing. She died young, only 31, free, yes, but poor, mostly forgotten by the world that once praised her genius, but her words lived on. When we talk about American liberty, Phillis Wheatley should never be an afterthought. She was one of its earliest, most moving voices, singing freedom's praises while still in chains. She believed in a country's promise before it believed in her. That takes more than talent. That takes courage. Because sometimes the truest patriots aren't the loudest, but those who hold up a mirror and gently, powerfully say, "This is who you claim to be. Now be it." She had written for presidents and kings. She had once stood as a symbol of brilliance, proof that intellect knew no chains. And yet, in the end, Phillis Wheatley died in obscurity, alone, poor, and nearly forgotten. How can a life so full of promise end in silence? That's the tragic irony of her story. It was a cold winter evening in Boston, 1784. The war was over. The streets still echoed with talk of liberty flags flying, speeches, new ways of governing. But for Phillis Wheatley, the promises of freedom never quite arrived. She was in a small boarding house holding a sick child, her third. The first two had already passed. Her husband, John Peters, a free black man of spirit and ambition, was in debtor's prison. He tried to build a life selling groceries, opening a bookstore, even saying he'd republish her poems. But the economy was brutal, especially for black families with no land, no connections, no one to back them. Phillis, once invited to read in fine Boston homes, was now washing clothes just to buy bread. I can almost see Sarah, a white woman from a nearby house, seeing her once famous neighbor hauling a bucket of laundry through the snow. Is that her? She might whisper, didn't she write that book? Yes. That book, poems on various subjects, religious and moral, the first by a black woman in America. The same book Voltaire praised, admired in England, and endorsed by George Washington. Now barely remembered in her own city, she kept writing. That's the part people often forget. Even when no one listened, Phillis kept composing verse on scraps of paper, by candlelight, between moments of work and grief. She wrote of loss, of hope, of struggle. But without the Wheatley family, who had freed her but also once sponsored her, and without the connections she'd briefly had in London, her second manuscript never found a publisher. It vanished, just as she nearly vanished from memory. I met her once, Thomas, a black veteran of the Revolution. "You're Phillis Wheatley, right?" I asked. "I read your poem before we marched on Yorktown." I smiled, proud, but even I didn't know how hard things had gotten. How, despite her fame, Phillis shared a single room with her baby, boiling water on a borrowed stove. Freedom came, yes, but it didn't come with security or support, especially not for black Americans, and especially not for women. She died that December, just 31, buried in an unmarked grave, her infant son following her only hours later. No fanfare, No obituary, just silence, and yet her words never truly disappeared. Generations later, Black poets would find her. They would read her work and see not only what she wrote, but what she endured. Her voice, once stifled, would echo in classrooms, protests, and libraries across the country. So when we speak of American freedom, let's not forget its cost and who paid it. Phillis Wheatley believed in liberty when it gave her nothing in return. She wrote not because she was welcomed, but because she had something to say. And in that act alone, she changed history, quietly. Unforgettably, imagine a young girl, barely 10, ripped from her homeland, her name, her language, everything familiar. Now imagine that same girl, a few years later, standing on the edge of literary history. That's the legacy Phillis Wheatley left behind, not just as a poet, but as the very first Black American woman to be published, in a time when most Black people weren't even seen as fully human. Her words did more than fill pages, they opened a door that had never been opened before. In 1773, the colonies were stirring with talk of revolution, liberty, rights, freedom. But in Boston, a quiet revolution was already happening. A small book appeared, poems on various subjects, religious and moral. Its author, Phillis Wheatley, an enslaved girl, educated by the family who owned her, the Wheatleys. They saw something in her, a curiosity, a brilliance, and allowed her to study alongside their children. Latin, Greek, theology, history. Imagine her sitting beside Mary Wheatley, both girls bent over their books, but only one with chains on her future. Phillis's work wasn't just good, it was extraordinary. Her poems mirrored the classical style that white readers admired, gods and muses, structure and symmetry, but her voice was her own. And in a society that doubted Black intellect at every turn, that voice shattered assumptions. It made people stop. It made them listen, of course. Not everyone believed a Black girl could have written such things. So the Wheatleys had to gather a group of Boston's most respected men to question her. Imagine that, sitting in a room full of powerful white men, being asked to prove your own genius. But she did. They signed a document swearing that yes, she wrote these poems. That one page, her certificate, was the key to her publication in London. And her success overseas, it made waves. People like Benjamin Franklin and even Voltaire noticed. George Washington praised her poetry, but while the world applauded, Phillis still had no legal personhood. She wasn't free. Her own words could travel across the ocean, but she herself could not, unless given permission. Even after she gained her freedom, life didn't get easier. She tried to publish a second volume, but the American market wasn't ready to support a free Black woman writer. No backers came. Her voice, once hailed as miraculous, was now a whisper. Still, that whisper carried. Imagine me, Thomas, a young Black apprentice in Philadelphia, picking up a worn copy of her book decades later. Or Sarah, a teacher in a freedmen's school after the Civil War, reading Phillis's poems aloud to her students, proof that their voices mattered too. Phillis wasn't just a poet, she was the beginning of something. Her pen planted a seed, and from that seed would grow a literary tradition that refused to be silenced. When we talk about the birth of Black literary America, it doesn't start with protests or universities. It starts with a girl who turned her captivity into creation, who believed, against all odds, that words could build a place for her in a world that tried to erase her. That's the power of legacy, not just what we remember, but what we become because of it.